Johnny Carson's most high guests, the nights he merely lost control. The room that could tip. Johnny Carson hosted thousands of guests. Most of them came out smiling, sat down, told a story, and gave the audience exactly what they came for. A few did not. A few walked through that curtain with eyes that moved a little too slowly, with timing that arrived one beat late, with an answer that started in one place and ended somewhere nobody could follow.
And then I don't ever offer my work around, as it were. I mean, I just sort of keep it, and then various people hear about that, and they sort of...
Right. The second that happened, Johnny had a problem. The audience was still laughing. Carson was already counting. Whether the camera needed to swing to Ed, whether the band could cover the next 90 seconds, whether this was the kind of trouble a joke could fix, or the kind of trouble that did not have a name yet. Tonight, we are looking at Johnny Carson's most high, drunk, and visibly altered guests. The ones who made him work harder than anyone watching at home ever realized. The ones who pushed the room to a place no host wanted to be. Some of them were funny. Some were brilliant. One of them changed Carson's face in a way nobody at NBC had ever seen before. And by the end of this story, you will understand the one skill that kept The Tonight Show alive for 30 years. It had almost nothing to do with telling jokes. It was knowing the exact second the room stopped being safe. The second before the room slipped. Most people thought Johnny Carson's job was to be funny. It was not. His real job was to notice the second before a room changed, a laugh that came back one beat late, a guest who smiled too long before answering, a story that began clearly, then wandered off the road before anyone knew where it had gone, a small look from Ed, a shift in the band, a silence from the audience that was not empty. Exactly. But waiting for someone at the desk to tell them what kind of silence it was. Carson saw those things early. That was the part of hosting nobody at home could see. The Tonight Show looked like a friendly conversation. A famous person came out, Johnny shook a hand, the audience clapped, a few jokes landed, the band played, America went to bed feeling that everything had been easy. But easy was the illusion. Every night, Carson sat across from someone whose mood, chemistry, timing, ego, and exhaustion he could not control. The lights came up, the first guest sat down, and from that moment forward, Johnny was reading the room the way a careful man reads a dark road. He did not wait until the danger had a name. He eased off the gas before anyone else saw the shape ahead. When a guest started slipping, Carson almost never reacted in a way the audience could point to. His shoulders did not tighten, his smile did not vanish. He did not turn toward the producer or make a joke that would expose the person sitting across from him. He did something smaller. He shortened the question. A long question became a simple one. A story prompt became a yes or no. A winding road became a straight lane. He gave the guest less distance in which to drift. If that did not work, he gave Ed more room to laugh. He let the band cover a rough turn. He let the camera find a safer face. And if none of that was enough, he knew exactly where the emergency exit was. The commercial break. There was a rule in late-night television that nobody printed in a handbook, but every good host eventually learned. A guest could be drunk and still help the room. A guest could be tired and still help the room. A guest could be strange, sad, angry, jet-lagged, or chemically far away from the rest of the studio and still help the room. What a guest could not do was leave the room completely. The moment a guest's mind went somewhere the audience could not follow, Carson had a different job. He was no longer just the host. He was a translator. There were always two rooms. The studio, where 200 people could feel every pause, and the living room, where millions of Americans were watching through glass, waiting for Johnny to tell them that everything was still fine. On most nights, the translation was easy. On these nights, it became the whole show. The first guest tonight is the gentlest case. A man who later admitted, in his own words, that he was usually high during those years. He did not collapse. He did not embarrass himself. He did not make the room unsafe. He simply moved on a slightly different clock. And Carson, sitting across from him, was the only person in the building who seemed to know exactly how to keep time.
Don't you worry a little anyway? Maybe they didn't get it right. Maybe a guy on drugs installed the spikes. Or maybe you're on drugs. And you're hoping you're going forward. Say, am I backing up? Well, let me take a look at the spikes. Oh, can't see them. Better back up a little.
The stoned sage in the tan jacket. George Carlin first walked through the Tonight Show curtain in the early 70s, and he came back, by his own count, more than 100 times. For most of those appearances, by his own honest admission in his memoir written decades later, Carlin was not strictly sober. He kept what he called a small herbal supply within reach almost everywhere he went, sometimes hidden, sometimes not so hidden. He has gone on the record about this. The estate has gone on the record about this. There is no speculation needed. What is fascinating is not that he was altered. It is what altered looked like for him on national television. You can pull up the old clips today and watch a man with the most agile comic mind of his generation sitting in a guest chair, and at first you would not catch anything. The jokes are sharp. The bits about driving and language and small American absurdities land. The audience is hooked. Then you start watching the small things. You watch the half-second before he answers a question. You watch the way his eyes settle on something across the studio, just for a beat, before he comes back to Johnny. You watch the way he laughs at his own setup, but not at his own punchline. Because the punchline is more interesting to him than the laugh. He is enjoying his own thinking the way most people enjoy a good radio in a quiet car.
Anyway,
Practicing.
yeah. When's the first time you did this show before? I took it over, didn't you?
Yes.
You go back to the Par days.
My first time on was with my partner, Jack Burns. Jack later got more fame with his other partner, Avery Schreiber.
You're right.
Burns and Schreiber. But got more fame. That's a strange phrase.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to say notoriety because I don't like that word.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? Dreams come true. Dreams come true.
Carson knew. The studio knew. The strange thing was that nobody on the staff seemed bothered, because Carlin, even at a slight chemical distance from the rest of the room, was still doing what a great late-night guest was paid to do. He was making the audience think. He was making them laugh. He was treating the chair with respect, and Johnny with affection. He was holding up his end of the deal. So Carson did something very few hosts in television history have ever done with a known altered guest. He let him work. He did not push. He did not pull. He did not steer with too many follow-up questions. He let Carlin's brain go where Carlin's brain wanted to go, and he caught the comedy as it came back over the desk. There is a long-running theory in late-night circles that Carson, who had a strict no-impairment policy in his own life by this point, deeply admired Carlin precisely because Carlin had figured out how to be altered and still do the work. What he never gave Carlin was the keys to the show. In 30 years, Carson chose dozens of permanent guest hosts, comics he liked, comics he trusted to drive the desk for a week when he was on vacation. Carlin, the most frequent comic guest of the era, was never one of them. It was the gentlest possible form of distance. The host did not stop calling. The bookings kept coming. The hugs at the end of the segment were real. But the chair at the center of the show was never offered. Carson respected the comedy, He just was not going to hand his own steering wheel to a man whose driving he had been quietly watching for years. Carlin was the manageable version of distance. He moved on a different clock, but the clock still worked. The jokes still arrived. The audience still knew where to laugh. The harder kind came when the gift was still there, but the guest began drifting away from the question before Carson could bring him back. That was Richard Pryor.
Yeah. Are you still straight now?
Yeah?
Yeah.
Still, I haven't had... Johnny says that. I think he's talking... You're talking about drugs and liquor,
Yeah,
right?
liquor, yeah.
Good. Okay.
I wouldn't even get into the other.
The genius who kept drifting home. Richard Pryor was the first guest in this story who made Carson's job feel almost unfair. With Carlin, the timing was slower, but the mind stayed sharp. With Pryor, the mind was brilliant, wounded, dangerous, and sometimes already halfway into another room before the question had finished crossing the desk. Pryor did not just tell jokes. He opened a door in himself and made the audience walk through it. Childhood, race, fear, addiction, shame, anger. He could turn all of it into laughter before the room realized what it had agreed to laugh at. By the late 70s, Pryor was one of the most important comedians alive. Not popular, not famous, important. He had taken the form of stand-up comedy and pulled it open in a way that had not been done before him and has not been done quite the same way since. He could sit on a stool with a microphone and rebuild an entire American childhood in front of a paying audience, scene by scene, character by character, and at the end of the hour, the room would not know whether they had been watching a comedy show or a piece of theater. He was also, by his own later admission, and by every credible biography of his life, fighting a problem with hard substances that was getting harder every year.
Yeah.
I haven't had drugs in a long time now, and it's the first time that I really am trying to do something about it to stay off of it, and I've been off a long time now, and it's wearing off.
No, you look good.
You know how your body builds up residue? Well, I got about 30 years of residue. So I'll be high another 2 years at least.
When Carson booked him, the country saw a national treasure. The staff saw something more complicated. There is a specific 1978 appearance that fans of the show still talk about. Pryor came on. He was funny for the first 3 minutes. He was on fire. He was the Pryor people came to Carson to see. And then, somewhere in the middle of an exchange, his focus drifted. You can watch it in the old clip. Carson asks a small follow-up question. Pryor's eyes leave the desk. They go somewhere off to the side of the camera. They stay there for a beat. Then he comes back, but he does not come back to the question. He comes back to a story that nobody in the building had been telling, about a place that had nothing to do with the previous answer, with a tone that suggested he had been having a different conversation in his head for the last 10 seconds. The audience kept laughing. Pryor was Pryor. The audience would have laughed at almost anything. Carson did not laugh. Or rather, Carson laughed with his face, but his eyes did the work his face was hiding. He waited. He gave a tiny, gentle prompt. He pulled Pryor back, the way you might gently take the wheel of a car that is starting to drift toward the line. He never named what he was seeing. There was no joke about it. There was no head turn to Ed. There was no glance at the producer in the wings. Carson treated his guest the way a careful old friend treats a brilliant person who is going through a hard year. He held the space. He kept the conversation moving. He did not push for a long answer when a short one would do. 2 years later, the country learned what some people inside the building had probably already feared. Richard Pryor was severely injured in a freebasing incident that nearly took his life. He spoke about it later. He took ownership of it.
Something about, what was that now? Something about you're back on drugs
I said
again.
I was back on drugs, and I read it, you know, it bothered me. I didn't know people took it, I didn't know you'd take it for a joke, because I thought people believed that kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And it bothered me, it really hurt me. And I said, well, why would somebody, who in the world print, and I couldn't understand it, so I called the people at the National Enquirer.
Right.
There's some English guy, owns it, I guess. He's the editor. I talked to him, I said, that's not true, those are lies. And he said, well, we've talked to several people. And I said, but I don't care, they lied on me, you know? It's not true, your information is really wrong. I'm not about that anymore.
He used the rest of his career to talk honestly about what had happened. When you go back and watch those late 70s appearances now, knowing what came in 1980, you start to see the drift differently. You see a brilliant man working at the very top of his craft, fighting something that the audience was not supposed to be able to see. And you see a host who had decided, years before anyone outside the building knew the story, that his job was not to expose the trouble. His job was to keep the conversation going long enough for his friend to get safely off the stage. Pryor was the guest who drifted away from the question. The next kind of trouble did the opposite. It moved faster than the question could follow.
They ain't no greatest nothing, because there's a cat working in Cleveland in a garage that can cut us all.
Right now, he'll
Right
show
this
up.
minute. If he just wanted to be in show business, he'd outdo everything.
The speed nobody could prove. After Pryor, you might think the hardest guests were the ones who visibly drifted. They were not. Some of the hardest nights came from guests who, on tape, looked completely fine. Sammy Davis Jr. came on Carson many times across the late 60s and 70s. He was, by any measurement, one of the most talented entertainers of his generation. He could sing, he could dance, he could act, he could do impressions of people who had not yet realized they had identifiable voices. He was a member of one of the most famous show business circles in American history. He had played the biggest rooms in Las Vegas. He could fill a stage with personality the way another man fills a stage with a band. He was also, by every account from the people who worked closest to him, a man who slept very little, worked constantly, and ran on something stronger than coffee. The exact details of what that something stronger was have been argued about for decades. There are biographies, there are interviews, there are family members who have given partial answers, and friends who have given different answers, and staff who have given no answers at all. There is no clean, official record of what Sammy Davis Jr. did or did not take in any given year. What there is, on tape, is a particular kind of energy.
Just like that. And if you think about it, then you're going to blow it. See, if you give too much concentration.
Just give the strawberries line.
Just give me the strawberries line.
I won't come to it again.
Okay.
You see what happens?
What?
You see,
I see.
you see what happens?
What?
It doesn't
Come on.
come while you...
If you watch his Carson appearances from the early 70s, you will see a man who is sometimes faster than the room. He talks at a tempo that is just slightly ahead of the host's pace. He starts laughing before the punchline finishes landing. His body shifts in the chair in small, restless ways, like a runner waiting for a starting gun that nobody else can hear. He answers a question, then doubles back on his own answer to add 3 more thoughts that the question did not strictly require. Carson knew this kind of pace. Anyone who had worked in show business since the 50s knew it. But Carson never named it. He never made a joke about it. He never asked a single question that would have forced Sammy to defend himself on national television. Instead, he did something subtle and protective.
Because show business is my life. Now we're going to... You got a film clip from the thing that's
I
coming up.
got to say one thing.
Yeah.
This is the only time in
Ed,
my life...
something we said?
No, Now, wait a minute.
Wait a minute.
Just a second.
Now, you go into the lodge hall.
I'm going to sell something. You started to look at the commercial. Are you going to do a commercial?
What?
Are you going to do a commercial?
No, we're not going to do a commercial. Sit down.
He let Sammy be Sammy. He let the restless body language read on camera as enthusiasm. He let the racing speech read as showmanship. He let the laughter that came a half-second early read as a man who simply loved comedy too much to wait. It worked because the audience had been trained to expect that level of energy from Sammy Davis Jr. He was, after all, the man who never stopped working. He could carry a Vegas main room on his own. The home audience saw a star at the peak of his powers. The crew saw something else. The crew saw a man who, on some nights, was clearly running on reserves that nobody in the building was going to name out loud. This is the gray area that exists in every old episode of late-night television. There were guests whose chemistry you could prove, and guests whose chemistry was simply a long pattern of staff observations that never made it into print. Carson treated both kinds of guests the same way. He smiled, he kept the conversation flowing. He let the rumor stay a rumor, and he let the star stay a star. He cared less about what was in your system than about what was in the room. And the room, with Sammy, was always electric. Carson was happy to let that electricity be the only story of the night. By now, the pattern is clear. Carlin moved a half step behind the room. Pryor drifted sideways from it. Sammy sometimes ran ahead of it. 3 different guests, 3 different kinds of altered energy. And somehow Carson knew what each one needed before the audience even knew there was a problem. That skill did not begin at NBC. It began much earlier, in Nebraska, with a boy trying to read a face that rarely gave him what he wanted. The boy who learned to read faces first. To understand why Carson could read Carlin, Pryor, and Sammy so quickly, you have to go back to the first room he ever tried to control. It was not a studio. It was not a nightclub. It was a small house in Nebraska. And the first audience Johnny Carson ever studied was his own mother. Johnny Carson grew up in a small Nebraska town, in a house with a mother who did not give warmth freely. Friends, biographers, and his own son have all said the same thing about Ruth Carson, in slightly different words. She was hard to please. She did not laugh easily. She did not hug. A compliment from her was a small, rare object that a child had to earn, the way a child earns money. Johnny was the kind of boy who tried. He learned card tricks from a mail-order pamphlet when he was about 12. He practiced them in the bathroom mirror. He put on small shows in the living room. He worked at it, year after year, because somewhere underneath the boyish charm, he had figured out a brutal little equation. If he could make his mother laugh, even once, he could prove he existed. This is not gossip. He talked about it himself, in later years, in the calm, distant voice of a man who had made peace with something nobody should have to make peace with. The first audience Johnny Carson ever performed for was a woman who did not particularly want to be entertained. When you grow up reading a face that is not giving you much back, you develop a skill almost nobody else develops. You learn to read the smallest signals before they become words. A breath, a glance, a half-second of stiffness in someone's shoulders, the slight change in the air when a room is about to turn cold. By the time most boys his age were learning baseball stats, Carson was learning the human face the way an old detective learns a courtroom. He carried that skill into magic clubs, into radio, into a daytime quiz show that nobody remembers, into a national late-night program that he would eventually own for 3 decades. By the time he reached The Tonight Show, that childhood skill had become professional instinct. Carlin needed patience. Pryor needed a soft hand. Sammy needed room to run. But one night, Carson faced a guest who needed something more than patience. The chair had to be cleared, and Carson had to do it without letting America see the operation. The empty chair. This was the night when every small skill Carson had spent a lifetime building had to work at once. The year was 1970. The country was halfway through one of the strangest seasons in its modern history. A movie called Easy Rider had come out the previous summer. It had cost almost nothing to make. It had made an enormous amount of money. It had turned a young man named Peter Fonda from a quiet character actor into the face of an entire generation that the older parts of America did not quite understand yet. Fonda was booked on The Tonight Show that fall. This was supposed to be a friendly appearance. He was the son of Henry Fonda, one of the most respected actors of the previous generation. He was coming on to promote his new picture. He was, by any normal measurement, exactly the kind of guest Carson loved to book. A movie star at the moment of his rise, with a story to tell and a famous family to reference. What walked through that curtain was something else. According to staff who were in the building that night, and according to reporting that has surfaced in the decades since, Peter Fonda did not arrive in the same condition his publicist had promised. People in the building later described his eyes as unusually wide. His attention kept catching on the studio lights as if he was seeing them for the first time. He greeted Carson warmly, but the warmth had a strange center to it, as though he was greeting Johnny from a slightly different floor of the same building. Carson, who had spent 8 years by then sitting across from every kind of guest a network could produce, recognized the signs in the first 10 seconds. He started with a soft question about the film, the kind of question that gave Fonda a runway he could not miss. "Tell me about Easy Rider. Tell me about the bike. Tell me about your father." Fonda did not answer the question. He started a sentence about time. About how time, he said, was not the linear thing that most people thought it was. About how the past and the future were happening in the same room at the same moment. About how Carson, sitting across from him, might already be someone else by the end of this conversation. The audience laughed, the way audiences laugh when they are not sure what else to do. Carson tried again. He asked about the film. He asked about Dennis Hopper. He asked about the road trip the picture was built around. Fonda came back to the lights. He looked up. He talked about the lights. He started a new thought. He drifted to a third thought before the second one had finished. His hands moved like he was holding something that was not actually in his hands. Anyone watching at home was probably amused. Some part of America had decided by 1970 that this was just what young movie stars sounded like. But anyone in the studio knew the difference. This was not a guest doing a bit. This was a guest who could not find the path back to the question. The break came. The band played out. The lights changed. 60 seconds of car ads and laundry soap played in millions of American homes, while inside the studio, something quiet was happening that the home audience would never see. When the show came back, Peter Fonda was no longer in the chair. There was no announcement. There was no joke about it. There was no kind explanation about how the guest had not been feeling well. The next guest was already seated in the spot Fonda had occupied 2 minutes earlier, and Carson was already in the middle of a new conversation, smiling exactly the way he had smiled before. That is the part that should stay with you. Not the wide pupils, not the talk about non-linear time. The silence afterward. The complete refusal to acknowledge on the air that anything had happened. The way Carson, who could have made a small joke and let America in on the trouble, chose instead to make the trouble disappear so completely that most of the country went to bed that night thinking the segment had simply ended. This was the translation in its purest form. The first room, the studio, had seen everything. The second room, the country, would never know any of it. Carson knew in that moment that explaining the disappearance would have been worse for everybody. Worse for Fonda, worse for the show, worse for the audience that had spent 30 minutes trusting that things were under control. So he disappeared the problem instead, and the only people who ever knew how close the night had come to slipping past him were the ones standing inside the building. This was the night that everyone inside that building remembered for years afterward, even though most of America never knew it had happened, because for a few minutes on a fall evening in 1970, Johnny Carson came as close as he ever came to losing control of a national broadcast. He saved it by making sure nobody could tell. But Fonda was the extreme case. He was what happened when the room no longer knew what it was watching. Not every altered guest put Carson in that position. Some walked out with the joke already printed on the ticket. With them, Carson did not have to hide the trouble. He only had to play the square man well enough to make the trouble funny. The two men who came pre-warmed. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong belonged to a safer category. They did not create panic because they did not hide the premise. Their entire act was built around two stoned men trying to survive an ordinary day, and by the time they reached Carson's couch, the audience already knew the game. That made them different from Peter Fonda. With Fonda, the room had to figure out what was wrong. With Cheech and Chong, the room had already been invited into the joke. So Carson played the only role available to him. He played the perfectly square late-night host who somehow had ended up sitting across from these two men, and he made the joke about himself. He raised his eyebrows at the slowest of their answers. He looked at his own desk like he was checking that everything was where he left it. He took a sip of his coffee mug at exactly the right moment. The audience howled. Cheech and Chong howled. This is the trick most viewers miss when they watch comedy bits with persona-based performers. The act only works if somebody in the room agrees to be the straight man. When Cheech and Chong came on Carson, Johnny gave them that gift for free. He played squarer than he had played in years. He turned himself into the dentist next door, the accountant from across the street, the cab driver who was just trying to get these two out of his back seat. The Tonight Show, on those nights, was the safest possible kind of chaos. It was a small park where everyone in the audience already knew what game was being played, including the comedians playing it. For Carson, this was easy weather, light wind, clear sky, the kind of segment a host could enjoy without burning a single ounce of his reserves. Cheech and Chong were safe because the audience knew the game. The next guest was different. He was not playing slow. He was not playing stoned. He was moving so fast that the show itself had to decide whether to chase him or stand still and let him circle the room. Carson chose to stand still.
Serious actors.
Yeah. Olivier, yo. Never become attached to a house. Never. And the judge said all the money. And we'll just shorten it to alimony for the people at home. Divorce from the old Latin word divorciarum, meaning having your genitals torn out through your wallet.
That's from the Latin. I didn't know that.
That's kiss your assets goodbye.
The brain that outran the couch. By the late 70s, a young comedian from California started walking onto The Tonight Show, and almost immediately, the whole format had to bend to fit him. His name was Robin Williams. If you have ever watched any of his early Carson appearances, you already know the energy. He did not sit in the guest chair. He stood up, he moved, he grabbed the curtain, he grabbed the desk, he grabbed the microphone if there was a microphone to grab. He did 4 voices in one sentence, and then commented in a 5th voice on the 4 voices he had just done. He left chunks of his own jokes on the floor because a better joke had occurred to him mid-sentence, and there was no time to finish the first one. The audience loved every second of it. Carson loved it too. But Carson, on a few specific nights, was not just watching a hyperactive comedian. He was watching a hyperactive comedian who had told the world over and over again in later interviews that he had a substance problem in those years. Williams himself spoke about this for the rest of his life. He never hid it. He talked openly about the cocaine years. He talked openly about how he eventually walked away from it. He named the date. He named the reason. He named the people who had helped him get clean. So when you watch his old Tonight Show appearances now, you watch them with knowledge that the staff in the building did not always have, and that the home audience definitely did not have. You watch a young man whose own brain, by his own later admission, was being pushed even faster than its natural top speed. And here is the thing that almost no other host could have done. Carson let the speed land. He did not try to keep up. He could not. Nobody could. He did the wisest thing a host can do with a guest who is running faster than the format. He gave Robin the field, and he became the only fixed object in the room. He sat. He laughed. He let the energy come at him. He treated his own desk like a small lighthouse, and he let Robin spin around it as long as Robin needed to spin. You can watch the clips and see it. Carson does not interrupt. He does not redirect. He does not even ask many follow-up questions. He just laughs. Sometimes he laughs harder than the audience. Sometimes he laughs until he has to look down at his desk to recover, the way a man laughs at his own kitchen table when an old friend has just said something genuinely surprising. Was Robin Williams sometimes chemically lifted during those segments? By his own account, yes. By his own account, yes. By many serious biographies of him, yes. Did Johnny Carson know? Of course he did. By the early 80s, Carson had been hosting comics for 20 years. He could read a comedian's timing the way a musician reads a bad note. He saw what he saw. What he did with what he saw is the most generous thing in this story. He gave Robin Williams a stage. He gave him a chair. He gave him a desk. He gave him the slowest, most patient straight man in late-night television. He gave him the gift that almost no other variety host of that era gave to a young comedian who was running too hot. He gave him a place to land safely, on national television, until the night was over. Robin's speed still had joy in it. Even when it ran too hot, the room felt invited along for the ride. The next kind of guest did not invite the room. He hit it like a siren.
You know, I wonder if you're lonesome tonight. I wonder a lot of things. Like, are you human? How do you live with yourself? Are you a reptile with a nice hairdo? You snaky tramp! You lied to me! When you told me you love me, you never loved me! You said forever, remember that one? Oh, there's a joke, forever! Yeah, forever, honey! Yeah, what does forever mean to you?
The voice that came in too loud. Some altered guests drifted. Some sped up. A few, especially in the late 80s, did something different again. They came in too loud, and they could not pull the volume back down once they were sitting in the chair. Sam Kinison was one of those guests. If you do not know the name, picture a man with a long coat, a wild scarf, hair that looked like he had just stepped off a motorcycle, and a voice that could fill a stadium without a microphone. Kinison was a comedian who had built his entire act on screaming. He would set up a joke quietly, take you down a small path, and then explode at the punchline at a volume that other comedians simply did not reach. It was a thrilling act on his own stage. It was a complicated act on someone else's couch. Kinison was open about his struggles with substances. He talked about them in interviews. He talked about them in his own stand-up. He talked about them with friends who later became his biographers. He did not hide it. So when he came on Carson in the late 80s, the staff knew what they were getting. They were getting one of the most exciting comics in America, on a night when his volume might be running just a little hot. Carson did the only thing he could do with a performer like that. He shortened the runway. Kinison's segments on The Tonight Show were noticeably tighter than other comics' segments. Not because Carson disliked him, the opposite. Carson admired him. But Carson also understood that a guest like Kinison could only burn at his real temperature for a few minutes before the segment had to end. So Carson built the segment around that constraint. Quicker setups, sharper questions, fewer detours, a faster route from entrance to exit. It looked from home like a perfectly normal interview. It was a precision operation. That was Carson's quiet skill. He did not push his guests to fit a standard format. He bent the format around what each guest could safely do. There is something almost old-fashioned about that kind of care. In an industry that mostly treated talent like fuel, Carson treated his most fragile guests like neighbors. You did not show up to a neighbor's door uninvited. You did not make them defend themselves on their own porch. You just kept the visit short, and you walked away grateful. Carlin needed space. Pryor needed a hand on the wheel. Sammy needed room to run. Peter Fonda needed a door. Cheech and Chong needed a straight man. Robin needed a center. Kinison needed a short runway. Different guests, different dangers. One desk. The translator at the desk. The audience at home saw one Tonight Show. The people inside the studio saw another. They saw the guest, who arrived shaking. The coffee mug held a little too tightly. The producer in the wings making a small gesture. Carson adjusting the next question without ever looking away from the desk. On easy nights, both rooms watched the same show. On hard nights, the studio saw the problem, and the country saw the translation. A guest could lose a sentence, and America would see only a pause. A star could run too fast, and America would see only excitement. A comic could burn too loud, and America would see only danger turned into timing. And one night, a chair could be empty after the break, and America would simply see the next conversation. That was Carson's private service. He took the unstable version of the night and handed the country the clean one. The boy in the mirror. Maybe it all began in Nebraska, with a boy practicing card tricks in a bathroom mirror, trying to win a laugh from a face that rarely gave one away. Maybe that is why Carson became so good at seeing trouble before it became visible. He was not an openly warm man. The people closest to him often described him as cool, private, hard to reach. But on stage, with a guest in trouble, he could be strangely gentle. He let Carlin work. He let Pryor drift, then quietly guided him back. He let Sammy run hot. He made Peter Fonda disappear from the chair without turning the disappearance into a wound. He let Cheech and Chong play. He let Robin spin. He let Kinison burn for exactly the number of minutes the room could survive. That was not just hosting. That was a kind of protection nobody was supposed to notice. For 30 years, Carson made a deal with America. He would hold the difficult part. The audience would never have to see it. Of all these nights, which one surprised you the most? Was it Carlin, who almost no one suspected at the time? Pryor, whose pain was hiding inside the brilliance? Sammy, who hid his pace behind the brightest smile in show business? Or Peter Fonda, sitting in a chair that 60 seconds later belonged to somebody else? Tell me in the comments. I read them. Because the only thing better than watching Johnny Carson work for 30 years is finding out how many of his quiet rescues we are still discovering today.